Point system. In the Arduin universe, the ability to advance to higher levels is based on earned merit and not on acquisition of treasure. Therefore, points are given for many reasons, but not for gold or other treasure. After all, it is the act of robbery, not the amount stolen, that gives the thief his experience. The following chart is a guideline, not a firm law, for each situation is different and meriting individual adjudication. Now we have a chart with points given on the left, reason given on the right. 400 points. Reason given: death with successful revival, reincarnation, curse changed into another type entity, etc. 375 points given. Reason: being sole survivor of an expedition, acquiring the mightiest of artifacts, Satan's own pitchfork, nuclear weapons, phasers, etc.
Etc.
And I am reading currently from the Arduin Grimoire by Dave Hargrave. Am I saying that correctly?
David Hargrave.
David
Yep.
Hargrave. And with me, as always, is Dr. Scott Brunner, the weapon of mass instruction. And joining us today is the one, the only, you know him, you love him, game design master, Rob Heinsoo. Rob, it's so good to talk to you. Thank you for being here. What would people know your game design work from?
Sure. Um, Probably maybe Three Dragon Ante, the Dungeons and Dragons card game, and 13th Age role-playing game, a game I do with my buddy Jonathan Tweet, published by Pelgrane, and that has a Kickstarter right this moment. And for the second edition, also back in the day, fourth edition Dungeons and Dragons, design on that. Feng Shui and Shadow Fist that I helped with Robin Laws. I don't know. Shadowrun Crossfire.
Oh,
It's
you
an
did. I didn't know
interesting
you did
game.
Shadowrun Crossfire. Wow.
Well, that was one of those fun games where my company was involved and we recruited a whole lot of really fun people. And I got to contribute one really, probably I'd say really good idea that helped the game work, which was the actual Crossfire deck. Like the what it's called. And then I designed a lot of the expansion. So yes, I deserve credit, but I do not deserve lead designer credit on that one. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And
So
so,
I,
a bunch of games there's a card games, miniatures games like Dreamblade and D&D miniatures. Um,
I'm going to
Lately,
casually shout out
yeah.
that I can't believe how much I enjoyed 13th Age. Um, Again, D&D is not my main jam, but 13th Age is a game that I've read, I've run. Uh, I'm going to shout out Eyes of the Stone Thief by Gareth Ryder Hanrahan as a brilliant
Ha,
fantasy campaign that's
how far
based
did you
on
get in
Moby
it?
Dick. I
How far
never
did you?
ran it. I never ran it,
Oh,
but I read
okay,
it.
good. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and your voice in the 13th Age books is charming and illuminating at the same time. Could you briefly tell us about the Kickstarter?
Sure. We're doing a second edition. After 10 years, the main goal I started out with was to upgrade things that were available to the players that were kind of boring and not chosen, because I knew that there were spells and powers and things like that they just weren't that good. And I think that the design creep definitely occurred. I invited Jonathan to help with me, and Jonathan and I looked at everything over again. And some of the original intent is like together, like there's a new bard class, and I've never thought that any of the bards that I'd ever helped design were actually that interesting to play. And now we've got one that's really based on the type of magical music you've mastered: drums, talents, brass, voice, flute, strings, and spells and powers flow from that. That's an example of the kind of fun we're trying to have. And we wrote too much. Pelgrane, when we finally, the game is sort of a marriage of indie style storytelling and crunchy D20 rolling, and tries to handle both sides of the coin. And one of the big things, you get your one unique thing. That's always worked out. You tell the table that there's one super unique thing about you, like you're the only child born of a zombie mother, And then, well, the game master knows that's going to be an interesting campaign. But one piece that we didn't explain very well the first time around was icon connections, which is just the mechanics for how you interact with the archetypal NPCs that you're connected to in the game. And this time around, we wrote a total of around 50 or 60 pages of explanations of how you do it and examples. And Pelgrane based.
For people who don't know, what are the icons in 13th Age?
Sure, they're like really powerful. If you think about a Dungeons and Dragons world or a fantasy world, there's usually somebody like an Archmage. There's usually somebody like the Master of the Undead, who like we call the Lich King. There's maybe a leader of the elves, call it the Elf Queen. Leader of the dwarves, call it the Dwarf King. There's maybe an emperor like the human. We we call those people out. Well, and 13 of them originally, 12 now. And they have world spanning organizations. They're not gods, but they're not exactly people. And your character starts at first level with some sort of connection to one or two or more of them, that then plays out in the narrative when you get to add things to the story based on your connection with those groups. So we basically needed to like make two books because Pelgrane was upset with publishing another book that was over 400 pages. And so the Kickstarter, it funded really quickly. I kind of knew it would because ran a play test for the first draft, and I got 190 something serious playtest reports back,
Wow.
which is such a high number that in fact my publisher was angry with me for spending too much time on playtest reports, but I think it's worth it. Anyway, I knew that there were people taking it seriously and really wanted to help, and the Kickstarter has been very, very fun, productive, and I'm super looking forward to like getting out the new version of the game. And working with Jonathan means that you're always sort of looking at things from a new angle, even when you thought that everything was settled. So there are like cool new monster abilities being done right now, a better way that I never thought of, and Jonathan's like putting that together. So I'm excited for what happens with it. And so far the Kickstarter has been going really well.
Congratulations, that's awesome, and I will put a link to the
Good.
Kickstarter in the show notes. Which brings us back to the text we're looking at today,
The
the
Arduin
Arduin
Grimoire.
Grimoire. Could you tell us what it is, and could you tell us the story of your personal connection with this text?
Dave Hargrave was a role-playing designer back in the early days, probably before RuneQuest, when D&D was the most serious game out. Hargrave had his own world, very called Arduin. He published a series of books that look like, oh, let's see if it's possible. I don't really have
Here,
my screen
you
set
got
up
it.
right.
There you go.
All right, that's the second one.
Kind
Welcome
of
to Skull
pamphlets.
Tower.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to Skull Tower. And sort of typewritten. And he was originally involved a little bit with Chaosium and Greg Stafford and people, but he sort of published these on his own eventually, I think. And had a really brilliant young artist named Errol Otis doing them at first.
Ooh.
What's yeah, so I'm sorry. You're talking, and I just had to point something out. First of all, Iro Lotus is my favorite artist of all time. As far as fantasy, I was laughing because we were talking about that, and you mentioned this. I love that and I'm not trying to me, but
No,
Mr.
go ahead,
Hargrave.
please.
But on the very first page, it says special note: the artwork for the supplement is the sole doing of one fine young artist, Earl Otis, and he misspells Earl Otis's name. Just like, well done. Uh,
Ah,
it's so fascinating.
as a person who has misspelled the name of collaborators, I wrote in the recent playtest draft, I wrote Gareth Ryder Hanrahaha. Oh well. Yeah, so it's a fascinating look. The whole thing is fascinating. There's both the impact that it had on me when I was a kid, which is, I started playing D&D in 1974, but I wasn't around anybody. I didn't know a single other person in the state of Kansas who actually even knew what Dungeons and Dragons was unless I told them. So then moving to Oregon is when I got actually Melee Wizard by Steve Jackson taught me that that combat fantasy games could make sense, and that I probably should look at D&D again and try to figure out the actual rules. Which, yeah, so I was able to play more like the real thing. Arduin Grimoire, it's a kitchen sink. Dave
Yeah.
sort of seems to think he has his own system, but he never comes out and gives it to you. He just gives you pieces everywhere. And then it's full of these marvelous lists, like the one you started reading, of like experience points: 400 if you're dead and resurrected, 375 if you're the sole survivor of the expedition. Well, I wonder what happened to all those other people. And it's the flavor for me. I mean, if we really want to go into it right now, um,
Give us the flavor, Rob.
Oh,
Give us the flavor.
the flavor the flavor is wild,
yeah.
and it's the kind of place where, a giant black sword wielded by Elric might just sail over as a starship and plunge into the earth and carve a big gouge. I mean,
Well,
that was my version of Arduin, by the way. That was what I ran, and eventually published in Nexus, by Daedalus, the same company that did Feng Shui when they did Nexus. That's an example of like what you would expect to have happen in Arduin. And his character class stuff, he has special abilities tables where, well, you can either get +2 to resist illusions, or maybe you're the son of a demon and you get +2 to all your stats. And,
well,
and that's the one unique, my connection there is like, I grew up wanting that type of action.
yeah.
I found it in Glorantha, Greg Stafford's world. And eventually I brought pieces. I mean, Jonathan and I brought pieces of that over to 13th Age, when every character has a one unique thing. Jonathan's a real super Arduin fan. Now, the thing is, we both know that there's giant portions of these books that are either unreadable or useless. But what was interesting is, when he died, he had started releasing his new system. And there are specific things that he did, like realizing that average damage was fine for weapons. You're wasting time if you roll the dice. All you need to do is find out if there's a hit or a crit or a miss. And that's the kind of thing that Jonathan is like, that's how Jonathan thinks. And so the fascinating thing about Hargrave was that he started in one place, but he was not done with his evolution. And when I say, you ask about personal, there's many pages of this book, and I could turn to them, that say things like, this is my magic system, but you know what? There's a lot of really good magic systems out there. And if you make up your own using pieces of those, it might be good enough to get published in a book. So you should definitely do it. And he gave the address for Lee Gold's Alarms and Excursions fanzine. And because of him putting the address in there, I wrote for copies of that magazine. I started writing for it when I was in high school, maybe junior high. Yeah, right. And
Wow.
and just a fanzine where you had to pay money. I would type on stencils and put it out. Well, I mean, for me, Lee Gold is still doing his fanzine, Alarms and Excursions, and Robin Laws, Jonathan Tweet, James Nephew, who runs Atlas, Chris Pramus, Green Ronin, James Wallace, Nicole Lindrews. All these people, we were all at A&E together at one point. And so it was sort of like I know that the internet and online does this now of bringing people together, but A&E was that. I got into it because of Hargrave. And when I wrote Hargrave a fan letter, he wrote me back and said that the hobby needed new people, and he was really glad that I was writing for A&E, and and I should write for A&E and whatever and stuff like that. And then he died. So sad. Like, before I wrote him back, I was like,
that's
so,
heartbreaking.
well, it's reality.
There's so many things that you've mentioned in the last like 8 minutes that I literally opened up a Microsoft Word document. I'm like, I'm not letting any of these things go that I want to say things about that you've kind of mentioned earlier. And
I apologize because I
no,
ran right over the top of you.
there's nothing to apologize about. But you've gotten me excited in like 30 different ways. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we gotta like have to pause on some of these things because I think all of them are so unbelievably compelling and interesting. The first thing I want to talk about is and Ben, I don't mean, I'm sure that you have a few things you'd like
No,
to
you
come in
go,
on
man.
this
You
as
go.
well. But the first thing you mentioned is like the fact that Arduin Grimoire. By the way, I've never read Arduin Grimoire. I did a dissertation on and I read so much of like, oh, and now I'm totally blanking. What's the old kind of fanzine that Lee Gold used to do? Is that Alarms and
That is
Excursions?
That's
alarm
alarms
mystery.
and
That is,
Yeah,
oh my
excursions.
yeah,
gosh. Okay, perfect,
A&E.
fantastic. So I read, a bunch of those old things, but I'd always heard about Arduin Grimoire from the periphery, but until this podcast, I
Yeah,
never actually had a chance to take a look at it. So thank you so much for giving me that, not the excuse, but a reason to
yeah,
take a look at it. But the first thing you said that just made me like, you're talking about this being it's not an accessible point necessarily for a tabletop role-playing game. You don't pick up Arduin Grimoire and introduce it to people that have never played Dungeons and Dragons and say, "We're playing Arduin Grimoire. Let's just start at page one." Page one is overland travel. And everyone's like, "What?" Oh, and
what?
I'm sorry. Page point five was about how you can get nuclear weapons at some point too. Have I lost anybody yet? It reminds me so much of Dave Arneson's the Dave Arneson
the
game
fantasy
that
campaign
the
book.
first yeah the first fantasy campaign which I had picked up and read as part of my research around how like it's impossible like if if you've read John Peterson's Game Wizards, he goes
Yep.
through the whole concept of like how Dave was like, this is going to be the role-playing game to in the darkness bind them. This is going to be everyone's going to come back to my thoughts and philosophies about tabletop role-playing games. And I'm not even saying that his ideas and philosophies weren't fantastic, but if you can't make anything even slightly accessible,
Yeah, the
and
communication
I'm
wasn't
not,
there.
yeah, it's not supposed to be a criticism as much as how interesting I think it is that both Hargrave and Arneson are dealing in a format where you can publish nothing but
Yeah,
tables. And I'm looking at the Arduino Grimoire, and there's one page where it's got like a little fighter, and it's a little hexagon, and he's trying to explain like how things can come at you from different angles, but there's
yep.
no context for that. And yet back at this day, you could do that. And like it's weird, like the community, you had to know what was going on. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but what a weird Wild West community of like figure this out yourself. But I've got some cool rules I think you'll love if you can understand them. Uh,
Hargrave eventually, I mean, I'm not positive about this, but I think when people criticized that eventually, because games like RuneQuest, Chivalry and Sorcery, um, which was barely, I mean, barely made sense. I mean, I don't know if you've read Chivalry and Sorcery. I'm not positive it made sense. I think it did. I mean, I definitely know Lee Gold made a version of it later, like for Japan that made sense, but I'm not the original Chivalry and Sorcery. I don't know. Scott Bizarre. What was the guy? Symbolist. Anyway, but Hargrave, I think, took a little bit of that criticism to heart. So what he was trying to do before he died is he actually did design a version of his game that actually was made perfect, that made sense. And
sure.
he was referring to his magnum opus as Arduin, Bloody Arduin. And but it never came to fruition. Um, you might have found this in your research. There there are a fascinating series of designer interviews in the first two issues of Different Worlds magazine. I don't know if you saw this, but Lee Gold has one. I think Eric Goldberg has one. I mean, there's so many people. Greg Stafford, everybody who was anybody at that stage of design kind of like had like a multi-page, between 1 and 5 page long interview. It's
Yeah.
fantastic magazine.
hmm
And Hargrave was one of those. And you could see, I'm pretty sure I remember that he was like already beginning to say, hey, look, I'm going to put this whole stuff together. So when Jonathan and I say we love the Arduino Grimoire, we are fully aware that these little books are not so. And yes, at that time, the whole point was the dirty little secret was no matter how many times they said this is its own game and you don't need anything else to play, you were using Dungeons and Dragons to play. I mean,
Yeah. Right.
there's no other way this made any sense. You
Yeah.
were taking something, but the line about what was Dungeons and Dragons and what was your own game made it been pretty fuzzy because I mean
But
there were
that's because
differences in how LA, how LA played and San Francisco played.
right.
San Francisco played one way, LA played another way, and when people took their characters, they thought at that point that you should be able to take a character from any table and go join another table. And people would do that and would be horrified to like, what? are these magic items that you're using? This is insane, And the other guy is like, I can't help it if you people never heard of magic items. I nuke him,
Yeah.
And so
Again, I don't want to add this to my Word document, which is just going to boil
I
over,
nuke
but
him.
I mean, well, you can even talk about how the fact that what Lake Geneva was doing and what they were doing in Minneapolis was rather different. This
yeah,
concept of like kingdoms and things, and it's funny because that was the fourth thing that I wrote down is because you brought up alarms and excursions, this concept that you could write people. If there's one thing that hasn't changed, I think from 1979. By the way, when does Arduin Grimoire come out? When is this? You said before RuneQuest, so this is an early little document we're looking at. What year
I
is this thing?
think so. That's a good question.
Let's look on the internet.
So we're
77.
77.
yeah.
Okay.
77.
Yep.
So these folks are playing original. We're talking about OE. And I almost wanted to ask Ben if this was my second point on my Microsoft Word document is thinking about reading. Do you mind if I read something from the beginning of this?
I mean, it's amazing that you say that because I feel very compelled to return to the text. And if you're reading from the forward,
yes,
the forward is on fire.
right.
Scott, read to us from the forward of the Arduin
will.
Grimoire.
I haven't read this for a long time, so I'm just going to put it down and listen. All right, then.
After I've already made fun of Mr. Hargrave for not getting Earl Otis's name correct.
You just better watch out. Hargrave got some powerful magic. 400 XP is nothing to that man.
Concept of and this is a person who might have Satan's pitchfork, nuclear weapons, or a phaser, depending on what day it is. But he also misspells forward.
Oh, you critics. Snipers. Go on.
We teach English, right? It's so pedantic. Anyway, it's FORWARD, but you know what? Maybe that's on point, right? And Mr. Hargrave writes, about 3 years ago, fantasy role-playing games began to become extremely popular among gamers of all types. At first, it was something new and wonderful.
Pipes? Did he say pipes?
It says types.
Oh, good. All right.
Yeah, but I wish it said among all types. At first, it was something new and wonderful, and ideas and information flowed freely among the players. About a year or so ago, things began to change. The joyous game was becoming big business. Wizards of the Coast was trying to purchase. No, that doesn't say that.
No, it does not say that. That's Scott.
Yeah. And those non-amateur game designers took on all of the trappings of things that have profit as their main motivational force. Greed. Secretiveness. Secretiveness does not mean to create fluids. Hunger to, and in quotation marks, control the market. See, this is straight out of the Gary Gygax. Is he taking a pot shot at Gygax there?
Yeah, this is clearly aimed at TSR.
Yes, yeah. Sorry. Hunger to control the market and all of that other garbage. Amateurs who tried to publish their ideas were being told to cease publication if their ideas even, underlined, remotely resembled any those big business types had published. Yet those same people ripped the amateurs' ideas off quite freely and with dismaying frequency.
Ooh.
This supplement is offered in the hopes that it will infuse new life into the amateur side of fantasy role-playing games and stimulate the free idea exchanges so sorely needed to keep this type of gaming alive and viable. This supplement does not seek to replace or denigrate any other fantasy role-playing supplement or game, either professional or amateur. It could have been 3 times the size you see before you, but personal problems, finances, and lack of time, the entanglements of life, he doesn't say that, that was me, and lack of time required otherwise. However, if well received, this supplement will lead to others dealing almost exclusively with hundreds of new monsters, spells, and magical, spelled not MAGICAL or CKIAL, but straight MAGIKL treasures.
That's pretty
already
tight.
In use.
Pretty tight.
Yeah, I would agree. In the Arduin universe. I got the last line and then I'm done. This supplement is in rough form. Therefore, we apologize. There's no reason to apologize, Mr. Hargrave. Therefore, we apologize for any misspellings. Maybe Lotus will say something. And punctuation mix-ups, comma, and hope you'll bear with us.
Yeah, I mean,
the next one's great
you go
too.
ahead, Scott.
Yeah.
Again, this is again, I'm just so excited by this text, but go ahead.
I'm sorry. We have to read the next paragraph too. If any person, organization, company, or other entity, either singularly or collectively, is offended by any part of the supplement, We apologize for it. Now, this is the second time he's apologized. And then in full caps, he writes, sorry. The supplement is basically misspelled, original and conceived by myself. I hope you enjoy it. Because of problems, too numerous to list here, our original publisher had to withdraw at the last minute. Is he talking about Chaosium? What you see?
Probably. I
Okay,
think so. I don't quite remember anymore, but
I'll look it up on Wikipedia.
I bet it
yeah.
is true. I bet it's true. And I think, yeah, I think so.
What you see here is a last-minute effort by two of my best friends, Peter Savoy and Bill Voorhees.
Bill
Thanks again.
Voorhees. Hmm.
And I'm going to say something before we turn over. I don't know. One of the things that I find so unbelievably fascinating, especially about early tabletop role-playing game texts, and something that kind of you had said a few minutes, Rob, about like how people get excited about these things when you were playing early and you saw this thing because it was like people were giving glimpses of their own imagination. It's always the reason that I love the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide so much is because it's literally the conception of tabletop role-playing games through one subjectivity. You're getting to see one person really interpret it. And here, that's what Arduin Grimoire is as well. It's like this is one person's subjectivity. This is one person making a universe and the rules for that universe and saying, this is what I did. Play with it or do what you will.
Yep.
Given how much time we spend reading the Dungeon Master's Guide, it's interesting to me how the first edition DMG is probably more coherent than this text, and yet seems so much less inspirational. Like, you'll read a few
Sure.
pages, and I'm going to say like once every 4 pages we'll get to something, and we're like, "Wow, Gary, okay, that part kind of sang," but like.
Hmm.
I still want to go back to that point. I want to go back to that experience table.
Yeah.
Reading, phasers and nuclear weapons. What kind of a world is this? This is crazy. And according to Wikipedia, Arduin was a massive D&D game run in the San Francisco area. Greg Stafford played in it and asked Hargrave to write it up, and it was going to be Chaosium's first tabletop role-playing game release, but it was ultimately rejected by Chaosium, which I can kind of understand that too, even though this is crazy inspirational and fun. All right, should I go back to that points given table? Is that a
Yeah.
good place to continue, or you want to say something else?
No, that was actually my second point in my market studies. Like, why did we stop? It was getting so good. But I was hoping that Rob could I was hoping Rob could explain what the thing that we didn't provide context with is these are points. Are these experience points or are
These
these
are
points?
experience points. These are
Okay,
experience points. And the funny part about it is that of course I'm not really positive what the rest of the experience rules are. And the other thing is that certainly mathematically speaking, the amounts of experience that are required to go up levels, they get pretty high. 120,000, 200,000. That's 20th level, 25th level. Yeah. So it's sort of like, what exactly is filling up the rest of those? I don't know. I did have in the second, oh no, maybe it was the third volume. There were some very detailed, no. These are the actual movement charts now, where he gave you a round is this many seconds, and this is how fast everything moves. And it was like this table with like points and percentiles. And I was like, what is going on here? And at some point I did the math and I was like, oh my God. He actually set it up so the fastest human with a dex of what's the max human is just about hitting the fastest sprinter's speed almost exactly. So
Wow.
he'd worked it out by that time. He was starting to like do that kind of like, all right, I want movement rates that like mean something in the real world, which I don't know that he needed to do.
can I
Um,
ask? Can I ask you a question that's a footnote question to that? As Ben knows, I'm really fantastic with digressions, but I'm flipping through the Arduin Grimoire and I'm looking at all of these tables, and now you're making a comment that he was really good about on the mechanics of the game.
well, no. I, that surprised me. I was
Hmm.
very surprised to discover that actually there was some logic
Like logic.
behind it. Because I was like, what the heck is going on? And it was like, oh, okay, all right. He did start with something and then build on it. So yeah.
Well, my question to you is, I would giving Mr. Hargrave the benefit of the doubt is, as somebody that has designed 13 to age, fourth edition Dungeons and Dragons, how important if you had to make I don't know, like a pyramid or some type of polygonal system to explain what's most important for a designer of a role-playing game, where do mechanics, narrative, social systems, where do those all fit in? Is it important that games are flow perfectly from a mechanics standpoint, or I guess I'm asking you to say what is the percentage between thinking around how a game creates this aesthetic theme, and a game is perfectly balanced?
Okay, I don't think that perfectly balanced is the crucial portion. I think that um, if the math isn't perfectly balanced, but still ends up being fun and still ends up, and if the systems are, they flow together enough that people use them. Okay, just in the same way that when you watch a television series, sometimes if you think really deeply about what just happened and why there are bodies left all over and how in fact that is going to play out in the next few minutes after the show is over, you think there's no possible way any of that made sense. Well, with role-playing game systems, it's possible to have mechanics that don't aren't perfectly balanced but are still
Hmm.
incredibly fun. um as a rule, I mean, I sort of feel that what you're getting is my personal bias. My personal
Yeah,
bias is that games should have both.
sure.
um when we wrote 13th Age, we wanted every single page, and in fact every single paragraph, ideally, to be worth reading. We didn't, you know, we didn't want to
Huh.
have we didn't want to have a page that was like, yeah, the only reason that we have this page is because every role-playing game has it and it's explaining something and it's not adding anything new. It's like, I'm not going to bother doing that. We got so much hassle when I tried to like drop the price list from the game because I was just like, oh my God, this doesn't add anything. So instead I added interesting things to the price list. If you want to buy a kitten through most of the Dragon Empire, it costs 1 silver piece. If you want to buy a kitten that's guaranteed to be demon free anywhere near the Crusaders' first triumph, that costs 50 gold pieces because you're just not going to get it most of the time. And so,
That Yeah, that's not so much like the Arduino
so
Grimoire. I mean, that type of flavor literally is so interesting to me because it's coming from a human subjectivity of like one person. Who's like, let's add some flavor into this. Like that, I
yeah,
think that's brilliant.
I'm sorry. My dog, I'm going to move him down because
He's
although
so cute, though, for
he
those of you
needs to,
listening.
he's upset because my wife Lisa is gone at the moment. And she'll be back, but at the moment, all right, Digo, you're down there. And now I'm going to get this. Go ahead. What was I trying to say when you lost me?
So Scott had just finished saying that the unique, granular, and
Hmm.
fascinating detail that you put into 13th Age reminded him delightfully of the
Ah,
weirdness of the Arduin Grimoire. Is that right, Scott?
That is correct. Like anytime you get a chance to like kind of add those kind of flavor elements that are obviously coming from not the concept of like, an engine or mechanics or what do we need to have in here, but like, oh my gosh, I just want to throw in something absurd like a kitten that can't be possessed by demons. That's exactly what Arduino Grimoire is. It's literally
I
insights into how the
it's
way people interpret the
yeah.
world and what they're interested in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that kind of is how I ended up thinking. If if you've
Yeah.
played a bunch of role-playing games, you don't really need people to tell you things that you already know.
Yeah.
So ideally, we write entertainingly, the rules flow together and are fun to play. And that's part of why we're doing second edition, because there were specific character classes, like the fighter had a new style of power, flexible attacks, where you roll the die and then you decided based on the die roll what you were able to do. Cute idea. Jonathan hated it, wanted a simple fighter. I was too pleased with myself for having come up with it. And it turns out that although it could be a really interesting mechanic for some magical fighter, it's not very like it worked well in Glorantha, for example, with a character called a Windlord, but it does not work very well in 13th Age. It's Tico. It means my dog's name means I say in Spanish. And I may have to break and take him into a house if he keeps barking. So I'll keep talking. So
That's fine.
so when you ask the question, for me, it's important to balance both. I
Sure.
I basically get kind of depressed when if a game is really interesting to read, it can still be worthwhile. But if a game's systems are just not don't really understand themselves, or are too clunky, or just end up not being fun, that's pretty depressing. So
I have to ask, what does it mean to have a role-playing games system understand or not understand itself?
wow, I don't really want to pick on people.
Oh,
Um, so
We use a mechanic, maybe. That's maybe
sure,
a game you don't want
so
to mention you don't
well,
like.
no, here's some examples. Um, there are games that where there are mathematical choices that turn out I've that turn out to be better than everything else for no particular reason. Just and it's an action that a character can always like count on taking and stuff like that. And it's there's an example of now. I think a lot of times when people play games like that, they don't care because the truth is you can still have fun. It's the question mark is then if you get players like me who are a little bit more like, well, wait a minute, no, the math is wrong. To the extent that it can be like, that times you go to an orange juice stand and the guy's like, you can buy two small orange juices and get, you know, more orange juice than in a big one at the wrong price. It's like there are games that have this problem, and I sort of have an issue with it. Don't quite like it. It's more, I think there's a thing about just flow. It's like a user interface issue on a computer. How many die rolls are you required to make, and how many systems do you need to interact with, and how quickly do they resolve compared to how simple it could be? And sometimes, in the old days, we used crazy systems of dice pools and like challenge levels with different mechanisms going. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
shockingly, I mean, the truth is, like here in the Arduin Grimoire, like he's using Dungeons and Dragons because his to hit tables, the highest armor on his to hit tables is 2 + 7. Where have I heard that before? It's
right.
like, armor class 2 plate, and then it's +7. It's like, oh my God, it's there. And somehow that made it through second edition, right? I mean, it's like
Hmm.
that crazy backwards math. Um, so yeah, I'm sorry. I'm deciding I'm not going to pick on anybody today. I've already spent the whole day being kind. I'm going to continue.
that's
No,
fine.
I'm gonna give you an out on that. Although I was gonna say, probably the easiest thing to do without having to necessarily pick on systems is just to pick on earlier versions of, well, the early versions of Dungeons and Dragons. So the way the hobby was evolving, my out on this is like,
Yeah, Gary
hey,
Gygax will
no,
not complain.
right. And this entire podcast is often about celebrating Gygax. So it's and we do take our shots from time to time at Gygax, but generally, I mean, but I'm struck by this concept again, and this is something that I've been thinking in, and there's more than just an article. There's just a book in this concept of like like I'm a big fan that the biggest thing about any tabletop role playing game, or we talk a lot around tabletop role playing games being this revelatory medium. And I don't like to think, and I come from a literary background more than I necessarily do come from. I mean, I've been doing game studies for a long time, but uh, my point is this. I've always thought the thing that's revelatory about tabletop role-playing games is not the mechanics or necessarily, the things you can kind of print, or those kind of like concepts of around, you just mentioned like math going backwards. Like the math to me isn't important as just the permission that it gives us to create a practice of getting together with a bunch of
Hmm.
people around a table and saying, we're going, and I'm not saying that rules aren't important. I think that they are because I think that what they're doing is they're forming the basis of an explicit contract that the player is going to
Hmm.
use at that table to create the theme that they want, which is why we have so many different tabletop role-playing games, from Shadow Dark to 13 Age to the Fallout tabletop role-playing game, which I'm currently playing. All of those are basically a contract. But the thing that's really revelatory is the fact that we have now been granted permission to play make-believe, and nobody's going to make fun of us, right? I mean, they
And that we're going
will.
to have memories that we created together
Right.
with a particular group. It's a and I mean, I think one of the stories I heard when I was working at Wizards, and I do not know if it's true. Like I suppose I should ask John Peterson sometime if he thinks it's true. Was that when Wizards was like doing market research at some point, they found a group of people in Montreal who were still playing with the original brown box and
Yeah.
had been and hadn't had any contact, almost like the lost tribe, of
Love
like,
that concept of like the island, like the guy who's still fighting World War II in the island, like is still playing OE. I love that.
yeah, that's right. Now, I don't, thing is, I do not have any, I don't have
Sure.
any, no support for that. Um, Jonathan, for example, has designed many different role-playing games. And I know that I personally am more oriented towards, it's like I'm really, really happy to like do 13th Age, but in a certain sense, I'm not pressed to do other role-playing games. It's sort of like I have this flavor that I really enjoy creating and making, and I play other role-playing games all the time. But I know personally with my creative energy, I go ahead and design card games and board games.
Hmm.
There's a weird element of like I I feel happiest when I'm designing a role-playing game thing and I've got a card game design going at the same time. And so it's because, it's interesting, like working with people like Robin. Um, Robin is like, and Jonathan are very much always pushing the envelope for what you can do in role-playing games, and like the experience of like how it plays. And a lot of the indie designers are doing that too. Um, Baker and Powered by the Apocalypse games and stuff like that comes in and it like really shifts the territory. And to a certain extent, I acknowledge that I'm personally a bit more of like a person who's, you know, perfecting a specific style of music and really enjoying that specific style rather than going, and now I'm going to invent electronica. No, that's not me. That's not me.
So
If you had to put if you had to put one, I was gonna say through line through all of the philosophies that you've had through your design work, from Dungeons and Dragons to 13th Age to your love of Arduin Grimoire, what would it be? What's the one thing that doesn't matter if like you are going to have your name on a role-playing game, whether it's a mechanic or it's a theme or aesthetic? What's the like, it's like the little
Sure, it's
the
like
signature and the
well, no, it's probably the one unique thing.
yeah.
It's like I want to be able.
Oh,
I want.
nicely done, by the way, bringing in a 13th Age mechanic.
Yeah, no, that's it. I want to have a game where I want the people from the very start are telling the game master kind of what they want the game to be about and making up something that they've never. I mean, part of it is like you've played a lot of role playing. My word, here's words I imagine myself telling, and I say it to people when I meet them and play them the first time. I'm like, look, you've played a lot of games, maybe, or maybe you're new to this. But you've played a lot of games. Is there something you've always wanted a character to be, always wanted them to do, always wanted them to be involved in? Well, that may be too big a concept for them at first level, but that's where they could grow into. So who are they? Like, what do you want? Just tell me, and then we'll figure out if it can work. And then people come up with things, and and ideally, almost all the time, you can find a way to like make that happen. When somebody says, I want to be a dragon rider who, crushes the kingdoms of the world underneath my feet. You say, okay, so your first level, and the metallic dragons and Axis, and you're the only human being who they accept raw meat from.
huh?
And then they're like, yes, I am the raw meat Peter of the dragons. And so you have to sometimes you have to work with that. But yeah, it's the one unique thing. And I
That's
think that,
awesome.
yeah.
That's brilliant.
So tell me if I misunderstood this or not, but you said that you're happiest when you were working on a card game and a role-playing game at the same time.
Yeah,
What
probably.
is it about your mental atmosphere that seems most clement when you're working on those two things? Or why those two things? What is it?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I suspect that I should be able to figure that out. Um,
Like the
uh,
quick example I would give you is, I teach seventh and eighth grade,
mhm.
and initially I was like, oh, I'm going to be a teacher. This is great. I can write during the summer and devote my time to it. But 2 or 3 years in, I was like, I'm always happier during the school year. Like I get
Uh,
up at 5 a.m., I write, I go to work,
you have
I work
a
with the kids all day, I come home, I read, watch TV, cook, da da
yep.
da da. Da. And during the summer, yeah, I have more time to both read and write, but it does not make me as happy as working with the kids does. Um,
That's interesting. Yep.
so
I think
again,
it's I
go
haven't.
ahead,
So
sorry.
in your case, do you have an explanation?
I
Because I think
think
I
it's
can see one.
Yeah, my explanation would be that I'm an extroverted introvert.
Huh.
So my introvert nature will fall into itself in the summer, but I don't get any of that
Ah,
extroversion that I also still kind of enjoy. And again, being a teacher is perfect because there are times I can be like, you know what? I'm just shutting down. No one can ask me any questions until 3:15.
No,
Leave me
this,
alone.
yeah. I was saying the summer break. I mean, I'm a teacher as well, and the summer break is literally what I always think of as like the campaign hiatus in tabletop role-playing games, where you came in September and you were like ready to go with a new system, and like how long does that fire burn? Because if there's one thing that I think is true of all dungeon masters is that you need about 3 months downtime.
Hmm.
There's a lot of overlap between teachers and DMs because it's all about creating experiences, but
Yeah.
that is a
I'm
topic
really
for
terrible at finishing campaigns. My players mock
interesting.
me incessantly. I'm great at starting them, and then and maybe middling, but when it comes to the finish, not so good. So
Huh.
I think I have an answer, and one of them is that in both cases, as a designer, you have to think about people's experience. You have to
Yeah.
think about what do people experience as they play the game? What do they feel? What are their expectations? How are you guiding them and shaping their experience? And the thing about card games and board games is they are to a certain extent limited. There is a specific thing happening that's you can craft, and it may have more ramifications than you understand, but the truth is it's a limited subset of reality and you're defining it. Um, Role-playing games are a little bit different because the whole point is everyone involved is going to bring all their creativity. Ideally, in 13th Age is especially about this. We want, we're a half-designed campaign world. We don't want to tell you canon in this world. We want every table to be answering questions themselves and making stuff up. But that means you have to think really cleverly about, well, then what do you tell them? Because if you tell them too much, you take away their freedom to make their own great ideas. Here's an example. Like I the Orc Lord is dead in the 13th Age second edition. We decided no more Orc Lord. We hardly did anything with this icon. We don't need the baggage. This whatever. Sorry. But we don't want to tell people what happened. We want them to be able to decide on it. And Jonathan wrote one example that was so fun and so interesting. And I was like, but I'm not, because at first we weren't going to do examples, but then people said, oh, come on, we need an example of what you're talking about. I was like, well, I'm not going to show you that one yet because that's something people might come up with that themselves and then they'll feel special and cool. And it's like I don't want to be the one to be like, well, here's this great idea we had, so I guess if you have that idea it's not so great. And so there's there's an element of that has to go into the role playing, and there's also quite honestly the combination of left brain right brain is harder with role playing
Hmm.
because you're simultaneously, for me, maybe for other people it's not, but you're trying to craft prose that's worthwhile and not stupid at the same time as you're handling the mechanics of the systems. And I think different people have different skill levels and stuff like that. And I think the pandemic hurt my writing a little bit, I think, but it didn't hurt my mechanics. So that's probably, yeah, that's probably
How
partly where I'm at.
how often do you DM versus play? And what's the percentage between the two?
Oh, wow. Okay. In the very recent past, the answer is that I've been playing and DMing almost the same amount,
Wow.
which is very unusual because before that, I was very often being the game master. But now that I think of it, for the playtesting of 13th Age, Jonathan ran more than I did. Um, and so in the last year or two, it's been very different. Yeah. So before that, I would say nearly always game mastering. There would have
Yeah,
been a time
right.
in my life you would have, it would have been like, oh, come on, is that even a question?
So yeah,
But
yep, yep,
but
yep.
lately that's not the case. Lately I'm actually playing a lot.
So what's the favorite class that you play, and why do you play it?
Well,
In a perfect world, like
oh, I was gonna say
outside
I
of
can't really say that. I mean, it's like there's an well, I can, but no. I mean, look, I really want to. I'm playing a bard right now, and I'm loving it because it's the
Hmm,
class I just made. And
sure.
as my friends say, Rob, what did you just make so we can play the new broken stuff that's overpowered? And I use an expletive and the word you, and so yeah. Well, Rob, what's hot off the press? So we can play the broken thing. Yeah, maybe. Um,
Well, like
I am playing a cleric right now, and Jonathan actually wrote something in the book about why he has trouble playing clerics. And I responded with another one of our Jonathan says, Rob says, and that is exactly why I like playing them. So, yeah.
we always try to keep it to about an hour, so we're gonna wrap up now. But
All right.
and you gave us the perfect closing here. But before we close, I want to say we'd love to have you on sometime again, even if it's just to go over another page of the
Another
Arduin
page of the
Grimoire.
Arduino Grimoire.
Yeah, like
We
we
can
didn't.
find something.
I want to
I
point out. Yeah,
we
We
didn't
need
get
another
very far.
podcast. We need another podcast
yeah,
called "Reading the Arduin Grimoire" with Rob Heinsoo. Like we need to do this entire thing
yeah,
for.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, if you come on again when you don't have a Kickstarter, we'll pay you. So, there's that too. Um,
What?
I know we'll pay you to come on and talk into a can.
We're so flush with
What?
cash.
Yeah,
I don't understand.
not we're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
exactly sitting on golden chairs here, but we can throw a little money your
Alrighty
way.
then. Alrighty
Um,
then.
so you mentioned the thing that I was going to highlight as we ended. Um, I would say to the audience, you will notice that Rob is an incredible font of game design, wisdom, experience, knowledge, and eloquence. And in 13th Age First Edition, there were these delightful sidebars where Jonathan and
Yeah.
Rob would each give their takes on different things in the game. And I assume you're going to have that in second edition?
Yes, we have not written as many of them as will be in the final because in certain cases it's not clear who's going to win yet. But like for example, the icon connection rules, Jonathan and I play them differently, and we I there is my rules, and then there's Jonathan going, this is not how I do it.
You know,
So
I don't know that I can think of another game that is a partnership quite like 13th Age. Can you, Scott? Like obviously D&D editions have
Uh,
teams.
huh.
no,
Um
it's so funny that you mentioned that because I literally looked away from the screen and I was trying to think of like I think there's nothing more fascinating than the fact that 13 Age is and I know we're running out of time, but there's what a topic to talk about. The concept of like we've got third edition mechanics meeting fourth edition mechanics, meaning the two designers that are like the last episode we had, we talked about how everyone who's ever worked on Dungeons and Dragons always comes out with like their own fantasy role-playing game in some way because they're
Huh.
like
Yeah.
we've got to we have so many things that we have to say that we weren't allowed to say on
That's
camera,
right.
right? Like
That's right.
um and I think that's I always think about Monty Cook's Arcana Unearthed, where like all these ideas that he was bristling with that people are like, you can't go that far. The same way that Zeb Cook was wrestling with the concept of like, we wanted to get rid of declining armor class, but people are like, no, we can't do
Oh,
that.
man,
Right?
yeah.
There's this
Bummer.
constant like if you're in the lane of if you're entangled with the capitalistic exigency of like creating a role-playing game that everyone's going to buy, and this completely relates to the Arduin Grimoire. Isn't the things that are most fantastic when people are like, well, here are the footnotes that you didn't get to see. Like, here's what we really wanted to do.
Yeah,
And I
funny.
feel like 13 Age is very much, but to answer your question, Ben, I'm sorry I went so far afield, is can I think of role playing? And I'm so interested in single subjectivities
Hmm.
because I think they reveal so much around lone observers looking at reality through one lens. Again, still not answering your question, Ben. No, I can't think of a role playing game that is
Actually,
two designers.
that's a really interesting question. I guess
because like I know there's ones that are teams, but I feel like oftentimes on the team there's a primary voice. Um
like when Steve Perrin. did RuneQuest.
It was Steve Perrin and friends.
Yeah,
I
and
don't
Greg
remember the
Stafford
friends.
was more involved with the world rather than the
Yeah.
mechanics. So it wasn't really like a partnership like that.
And ironically, Ars Magica was Jonathan Tweet and Mark
Yeah,
Reinhagen. Maybe it's just a Jonathan thing.
maybe because you're right. They definitely, I mean, honestly, I don't really remember anymore what the split of that work was. I do not know.
Well,
But given that Reinhagen went ahead and did things on his own also, with using some of the ideas, it's like, yeah, you're right. It is
yeah,
maybe a Jonathan thing.
yeah. Well, let me just say to our listeners, go to the show notes, click on the link that will take you to the Kickstarter for 13th Age Second Edition, where you will be asked to support the project in British pounds.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
But they translate so well, so fluidly.
into USD. Um, Rob, this has been tremendous. We can't thank you enough for being on the show. We wish you every success in the world with the Kickstarter and everything that you have going on in your own design life. Scott, you want to say anything?
I just want to say, and after you've supported that one, there's also a tiny little Patreon, which allows us to continue to ask embarrassing questions of all the designers that we have on here. Please stop by. And if you support our Patreon, of course, you have access to our Discord, where people can continue to tell us what questions we should have asked.
Can I read the lowest points given
Please, the point,
table? Like
Yeah,
this is the
yes.
sign
table is
off
so
right
good.
here.
Please.
Yes, yes.
Like 400 points with death with successful revival. 50 points. 50. Figuring out a trap. Tripping one and taking damage. All lesser spell use. Locks, knocks, wins. Going over half damage. Doing extra dangerous and uncalled for acts. Checking for secret places when you know there are traps, etc.
How many points did we earn on this podcast tonight? Is what I want to know.
I have to check the.
Am I close to getting? I want a phaser.
I'm watching the two of you because if only one of you survives, the other one's getting 375.
That's right. That's right.
I'm coming for you. You're only 10 minutes south of me. I'm getting in my car right after this.
If the tornado doesn't get me, Ben Riggs will.
That's right. That's right.
Oh,
Okay. Well, this was great, Rob. I don't want to take up any more of your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good luck
Thank
with
you.
Kickstarter.
Thanks,
And, good night, everybody.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.